What did you put?
Well, I would say athletics was the only other thing I was good at.
What do you do in athletics?
High jump.
02 to 07. At 7:43 on the morning of December 4th, Mike Tindall walked into a side entrance of a royal estate in Gloucestershire and discovered something so disturbing that within 90 minutes, Queen Camilla's entire future had been placed under emergency review. By noon, the palace had made a decision no one thought possible. Camilla was banned forever. The discovery. The morning began unremarkably. Mike Tindall, married to Zara Phillips and considered one of the most grounded members of the extended royal family, had been asked to inspect a property management issue at Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne's estate. What seemed like a routine favor, checking on some administrative confusion regarding a storage facility, turned into the catalyst for one of the most explosive royal decisions in modern history. Mike arrived early, the December frost still clinging to the gravel paths. The building in question was a converted stable block, ostensibly used for storing historical documents and archived royal correspondence. He had the access codes, provided by Anne's estate manager, and expected to spend perhaps 20 minutes confirming that everything was properly catalogued and secure. Instead, what he found inside that cold stone building would ignite a firestorm that reached Buckingham Palace before breakfast had finished. Among rows of neatly labeled archive boxes, Mike noticed several containers that seemed out of place. They were newer, unmarked, and positioned in a section that, according to the estate's official records, should have been empty. Curious, he opened the first container. Inside were financial documents, property deeds, and correspondence bearing Camilla's private seal. But it wasn't simply the presence of these papers that alarmed him. It was their content: transfer agreements for royal artifacts, appraisals for items that belonged to the Crown estate, and most troubling of all, unsigned contracts proposing the private sale of historically significant pieces to international collectors. Mike immediately photographed several documents with his phone and contacted Anne directly. Her response was instant and unequivocal. "Touch nothing else. Leave immediately. I am calling William." Within 30 minutes, Anne, William, and a senior legal advisor were reviewing the images Mike had sent. The air in that early morning call was thick with disbelief and rising fury. What Mike had stumbled upon was not a simple administrative error. It appeared to be evidence of systematic, unauthorized attempts to liquidate royal property. Actions that, if proven, would constitute a breach of trust so severe that no title, no marriage, and no amount of history could protect the person responsible. By 9:15, the palace had activated crisis protocols. Security was dispatched to Gatcombe Park. The storage facility was sealed. And King Charles, who had been preparing for a routine engagement, was pulled into an emergency briefing that would alter the course of his reign and his marriage in ways he could never have imagined. The warning signs. To understand how the situation reached this breaking point, we must step back several months to a period when subtle irregularities first began appearing in the administrative machinery surrounding Queen Camilla. These were not the kinds of issues that generate headlines or provoke urgent briefings. They were quiet, procedural deviations, small enough to be dismissed, technical enough to be explained away, that only someone with Princess Anne's meticulous devotion to protocol would notice, track, and ultimately refuse to ignore. It began in late summer with a routine estate audit summary delivered to Anne's office. Such documents arrived with numbing regularity, often dense with figures, footnotes, and cross-referenced appendices. Most were reviewed, initiated, and filed within hours. But this one lingered. Buried deep within the reporting was a single line referencing discrepancies in the tracking of ceremonial items transferred between royal residences. The amounts involved were modest by Crown estate standards. The language was vague but not alarming. Yet Anne's instinct, honed over decades of disciplined service and institutional memory, registered a faint dissonance. Something about the phrasing felt deliberately imprecise. She marked the page and requested a supplementary breakdown. The response did not arrive quickly. 3 weeks passed before the expanded documentation reached her desk, and when it did, the unease hardened into concern. Several high-value items, antique jewelry, historical manuscripts, and pieces of ceremonial regalia had been removed from secure Crown Estate storage. Their destinations were listed only as temporary holding facilities. No addresses. No standard custodial codes. The authorizations bore the signature of Camilla's office, but the justifications varied from restoration requirements to archival reorganization. Anne cross-checked each explanation against official palace maintenance schedules and restoration logs. None aligned. The timelines were off. The projects cited did not exist. Still, Anne did not escalate the matter. She understood better than most the gravity of even an implied accusation involving the queen consort. Rumor and conjecture had undone reputations before. She would not allow suspicion to outpace proof. Instead, she began a quiet inquiry of her own, consulting trusted estate managers, archivists, and security officers, individuals who had served the household for decades and understood not only the rules, but the reasons behind them. What emerged was not a single breach, but a pattern. Over the previous 18 months, Camilla had steadily extended her reach into areas traditionally governed by long-established committees and civil service oversight. A small advisory circle had formed around her office, composed largely of individuals with backgrounds in art valuation, heritage consultancy, and estate liquidation. They were not formally embedded within palace administration, yet they operated close enough to influence decisions before questions could be raised. One long-serving staff member, speaking quietly and without attribution, described a growing sense of unease. Requests had begun arriving for comprehensive inventory lists, appraisal histories, and provenance documentation, records that had not been revisited in decades. When challenged, Camilla's private secretary framed the effort as modernization, a strategic review of royal collections to better reflect contemporary values and public engagement goals. But to those who understood the Crown Estate's operating principles, the explanation rang hollow. Modernization did not require private appraisals. It did not involve undisclosed storage sites. And it did not justify the increasing opacity surrounding decisions once governed by rigid transparency. William became aware of the situation in early October during a private dinner with Anne at Windsor. There were no staff present, no formal agenda. After the meal, Anne placed a thin folder on the table between them. Inside were copies of transfer records, unanswered correspondence from estate managers, and a carefully constructed timeline charting the escalation of activity linked to Camilla's office. William read in silence. As he turned each page, his expression tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. He understood immediately what Anne was implying. If the movements were unauthorized, the implications were severe. If they suggested personal benefit or intent to leverage royal property beyond protocol, the consequences would be existential for the monarchy itself. They spoke briefly, deliberately, no speculation, no emotion, only next steps. William would quietly commission a comprehensive audit covering all property movements connected to Camilla's office over the previous 2 years, using external oversight channels insulated from palace influence. Anne would continue monitoring current activity, intervening subtly where necessary to prevent further transfers, and both agreed on absolute confidentiality. Until they had irrefutable evidence, the matter would remain contained. They could not afford to be wrong. An unfounded accusation would fracture the family, undermine Charles's authority, and invite scrutiny the institution could not withstand. But if their concerns were validated, delay would be indefensible. What neither of them anticipated was how quickly events would overtake their careful strategy. The audit was still in its early stages. Anne's monitoring had begun to encounter resistance. And then, on a frozen December morning, in a converted stable block long assumed to be little more than overflow storage, Mike Tindall stumbled upon something he was never meant to see. That discovery would collapse months of cautious planning into a matter of hours. And once it did, there would be no room left for discretion, delay, or deniability. The investigation deepens. The hours following Mike Tindall's discovery moved with a precision that revealed just how seriously the palace treated the situation. By mid-morning on December 4th, a secure room at Windsor Castle had been converted into a makeshift investigation center. Present were William, Anne, Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, 2 senior legal advisors from the Crown Estate, and a forensic accountant brought in from a firm that specialized in high-value asset tracking. Mike Tindall himself had been asked to remain available for further questions, his phone secured to prevent any possibility of information leaking before the palace had determined its response. The documents Mike had photographed were now displayed on a large screen, each page analyzed for authenticity, authorization, and legal implication. What emerged from that initial review was deeply troubling. The paperwork detailed a systematic effort to remove specific items from official Crown Estate inventory, have them independently appraised by private valuers, and prepare them for potential sale through discrete international auction channels. None of these activities had been approved through the proper legal mechanisms that govern royal property. None had been disclosed to the Master of the Household or the Lord Chamberlain's office, and all of them traced back, either directly or through intermediaries, to Camilla's private office. The forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Helena Marsh, who had previously worked on recovering assets for defrauded estates, explained the pattern with clinical precision. This is not opportunistic. This is planned. The documentation shows a progression. Initial inquiries about valuation procedures, followed by small test movements of lower value items, then escalation to higher value pieces once the process had been refined. Whoever organized this understood royal bureaucracy well enough to exploit its gaps. William listened, his jaw tight. And the ultimate destination for these items? Dr. Marsh hesitated only briefly. Based on the correspondence, private sale. The buyers were being cultivated through intermediaries, individuals with no direct connection to the royal household but with established relationships in the international art and antiquities market. Anne leaned forward, her voice sharp. Are we certain Camilla directed this personally, or could this have been subordinates acting without her knowledge? The legal advisor responded carefully. The authorizations bear her office seal. Several documents include handwritten annotations that appear consistent with her signature style. However, we would need handwriting analysis to confirm beyond doubt. But even if subordinates executed the logistics, the sheer volume of her office's involvement makes plausible deniability extremely difficult to sustain. It was at this point that Zara Phillips's role in the unfolding drama became clear. Mike had called her immediately after leaving Gatcombe Park, and Zara, who had grown up on that estate and knew its systems intimately, had connected several dots that even the investigators had missed. She reminded them of a conversation from months earlier when Camilla had casually asked Anne about the storage protocols for non-display royal items. At the time, it had seemed like innocent curiosity. In hindsight, it looked like reconnaissance. Zara also recalled that Camilla had expressed interest in modernizing the way the royal collection was managed, suggesting that certain pieces might be better suited to museum loans or even strategic sales to fund charitable initiatives. Again, the comments had seemed benign, but now, viewed through the lens of Mike's discovery, they formed a narrative of deliberate planning. By early afternoon, the investigation had expanded to include a review of Camilla's financial accounts, both personal and those linked to her office. What the forensic team found added another disturbing layer. Payments had been made to several art consultants and valuation specialists over the past 18 months, totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds. These payments were technically legal, drawn from discretionary funds available to the Queen Consort's office. But their timing and purpose, especially when cross-referenced with the property movements Mike had uncovered, suggested they were part of a coordinated effort to prepare royal assets for private sale. The question that haunted everyone in that room was the simplest and most painful. Why? Camilla was not financially desperate. She had no obvious need to liquidate royal property. The most likely explanation, though no one wanted to voice it aloud, was that this was about control, legacy, and the desire to secure resources independent of the Crown's formal structures. Perhaps she feared that her position, always somewhat precarious given her history, could be undermined. Perhaps she believed that building a private financial cushion was prudent. Or perhaps, most troublingly, She had simply grown to see royal property as an extension of her personal domain, something she had earned the right to manage as she saw fit. Whatever her reasoning, the actions themselves were indefensible. And William, staring at the evidence spread before him, knew that the decision facing his father would be the most agonizing of his reign. The confrontation. The meeting took place in the 1844 room at Buckingham Palace, a chamber reserved for moments when discretion was not merely preferred but essential. It had hosted sensitive diplomatic negotiations, constitutional consultations, and, on rare occasions, the quiet unraveling of family bonds in service of the crown. That December afternoon, the tall windows admitted little light. London lay under a slate-gray sky, the kind that flattened time and muffled sound, making the city feel suspended between day and night. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere was colder still, stripped of ceremony and warmth. King Charles sat at the head of the long polished table, his posture rigid, his face drawn and unusually pale. The strain of recent weeks showed in the fine lines around his eyes, deepened now by the knowledge of what this meeting represented. To his left sat William and Anne, aligned not just physically but in purpose. To his right were Sir Clive Alderton and the senior legal advisor, their presence a reminder that this was no longer merely a family matter. And at the far end of the table, positioned with unmistakable intentionality, sat Queen Camilla, alone, removed, and already isolated by the unspoken verdict gathering in the room. She had been informed of the meeting only 90 minutes earlier. No agenda, no briefing papers, only a brief instruction that her attendance was mandatory. When she entered and took in the arrangement of faces, the gravity of the moment landed immediately. For the briefest instant, her composure faltered. Then, with visible effort, she steadied herself and took her seat, folding her hands as if bracing against something unseen. Charles began without preamble. There would be no softening of the blow, no gradual lead-in. His voice was quiet, controlled, and strained with emotion he was clearly struggling to suppress. "Camilla," he said, "we have been presented with evidence of activities involving royal property that were not authorized through proper channels. Activities that appear to have been coordinated through your office. I need you to help me understand what has happened." The silence that followed was excruciating, stretching far longer than etiquette would normally allow. Camilla's hands tightened almost imperceptibly against the tabletop. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an unmistakable defensive edge. "I don't know what you have been told," she said, "but I have done nothing improper. If there have been administrative errors, they were made by staff, not by me," Anne responded immediately, her tone precise and unyielding. "Administrative errors do not explain private appraisals, unsigned sale contracts, and the systematic removal of crown property to undisclosed locations. This was not a mistake, it was a strategy." William slid a thick folder across the table toward Camilla. The motion was calm, almost restrained, but its meaning was unmistakable. Inside were copies of the documents Mike had discovered in the converted stable block: appraisal reports, draft contracts, correspondence with external consultants. Behind them were financial records tracing payments to advisors who operated entirely outside palace oversight. Camilla opened the folder slowly. Her eyes moved across the pages with deliberate care. For a fleeting moment, something passed across her face. Recognition, calculation, perhaps even resignation. Then she closed the folder and looked directly at Charles. "If mistakes were made," she said carefully, "they were made in pursuit of modernizing how we manage the collection. I was advised that certain pieces could be better utilized through loans, partnerships, and long-term arrangements. Nothing was going to be sold without proper consultation." The legal advisor cleared his throat before speaking, his voice formal but firm. "Your Majesty, the documentation suggests otherwise. Contracts were being prepared for outright sale. Buyers were being identified. And none of this activity was disclosed to the offices responsible for Crown Estate management. These are not exploratory discussions. These are preparatory actions." Camilla's composure began to crack. Her voice rose slightly, edged now with anger and desperation. I have given decades to this institution. I have been scrutinized, criticized, and judged at every turn. If I sought to ensure some degree of security, some measure of independence, is that truly so unforgivable? Anne did not hesitate. Yes, she said. When that security comes from property that does not belong to you, it is unforgivable. The room fell silent again, heavier this time, as if the words themselves had settled into the air. Charles had been staring at his hands, clasped tightly in front of him. Slowly, he looked up. The anguish in his eyes was unmistakable, laid bare despite years of disciplined restraint. "Camilla," he said, his voice faltering for the first time, "I do not doubt your service. I do not doubt your loyalty to me personally. But this," he gestured toward the folder, unable to bring himself to touch it, "this I cannot defend, and I cannot allow it to continue." William spoke next, his voice steady, deliberate, and entirely without malice. "The Crown Estate is not a personal resource. It is a public trust. What you have done, intentionally or not, violates that trust, and it places the entire monarchy at risk. If this were to become public, if Parliament or the press were to uncover what we have uncovered, the damage would be irreparable." Tears gathered in Camilla's eyes. Whether they came from fear, anger, or genuine remorse, no one in the room could say. Her voice dropped when she spoke again. "So what are you proposing? That I be humiliated? Cast aside after everything?" Charles closed his eyes briefly before answering. When he spoke, his voice broke. "I am proposing that we make a decision that protects the institution," he said, "even if it destroys what remains between us." The meeting continued for another hour, but its conclusion had already been sealed. Questions were asked, explanations offered, alternatives considered, but none altered the central truth. Camilla could not provide a credible defense. The paper trail was too complete. The intent is too clear. By the time winter darkness fully settled over London, the palace machinery was already in motion. Draft statements were prepared. Legal instruments were reviewed and refined. What would follow would not be loud or theatrical. It would be procedural, comprehensive, and devastating in its quiet efficiency. A ban so sweeping it would erase nearly every trace of Camilla's operational role within the royal structure. And with that, the matter would pass from family crisis into institutional reckoning, sealed not by anger, but by necessity. The verdict. At 6:57 on the evening of December 4th, Buckingham Palace released a statement that stunned the world. Effective immediately, Queen Camilla has been removed from all ceremonial, administrative, and residential privileges associated with the Crown. This decision follows a comprehensive review of irregularities involving Crown Estate property that were discovered during a routine audit. Her Majesty will retain her title but will no longer participate in any official royal functions, retain access to Crown properties, or receive financial or security support from royal household resources. This action is final and non-negotiable. The Crown Estate has been secured, and all affected parties have been notified. Further details will not be provided, as this matter is now considered closed. The words were clinical, almost sterile, but their implication was staggering. Camilla had not simply been sidelined or asked to step back from public duties. She had been banned, permanently and completely, from the very institution she had fought for decades to be accepted into. The palace's use of the phrase final and non-negotiable left no room for misinterpretation. This was not a suspension pending further review. This was not a temporary measure subject to reconsideration. It was an exile, absolute and irrevocable. Within minutes, every major news network interrupted their programming. BBC anchors read the statement with barely concealed shock, their usual composure shaken by the unprecedented nature of the announcement. Sky News brought in constitutional experts who struggled to find historical precedent for such a drastic move against a sitting queen consort. One historian, appearing via video link, noted that not since the medieval period had a royal consort been so completely stripped of status and privilege while the monarch remained on the throne. In the United States, CNN described the decision as unprecedented in modern royal history. noting that even during the abdication crisis of 1936, the language used had been softer, more deferential to the dignity of those involved. This statement, by contrast, was blunt, unsparing, and designed to communicate absolute finality. The public reaction split along predictable lines, but with an intensity that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. In Britain, older viewers expressed a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Many had never fully accepted Camilla, their memories of Diana still sharp and unforgiving even after all these years. For them, this felt like a correction, a long-delayed reckoning for a woman they believed had never truly belonged in the role. Online forums and social media platforms filled with comments ranging from "finally justice" to "she never deserved the crown" to more measured reflections on the tragedy of a woman whose ambition had ultimately destroyed her. Younger audiences, however, were more divided. Some saw the ban as justified, a necessary response to serious misconduct that could not be tolerated regardless of who committed it. The monarchy, they argued, had to demonstrate accountability in order to maintain relevance in a modern society that increasingly questioned hereditary privilege. Others questioned whether the punishment was disproportionate, wondering if a woman was being scapegoated for systemic failures within royal administration, failures that predated her involvement and reflected broader institutional problems. Several commentators noted the gendered dimension of the controversy, pointing out that male royals had survived scandals of equal or greater magnitude without facing such absolute consequences. Across social media, the hashtag #CamillaBanned trended within an hour of the announcement, generating millions of posts spanning every conceivable reaction. Some users shared nostalgic photos of Diana, framing Camilla's downfall as karmic justice decades in the making. Others posted images of Camilla from her years of public service, highlighting her charity work and arguing that one mistake should not erase decades of contribution. Conspiracy theories proliferated, with some claiming the entire scandal had been manufactured by William and Anne to consolidate their control over the monarchy, while others suggested that Camilla had been caught only because she had threatened more powerful interests within the royal establishment. In the United States, the reaction was even more dramatic. American audiences, particularly those over 50 who had followed the royal family for decades through the Diana years and beyond, viewed the announcement through the lens of their own cultural values. Several commentators noted that in America, such a scandal would likely trigger legal investigations, congressional hearings, and potential criminal charges for misappropriation of public assets. The fact that the palace had acted so swiftly and decisively, handling the entire matter internally without public accountability mechanisms, was seen as both admirable in its efficiency and troubling in its opacity. Talk shows devoted entire segments to analyzing what the ban meant, with royal correspondents flown in from London to provide context and speculation. But beyond the public spectacle, the truly profound consequences were unfolding in private, behind the closed doors and heavy curtains where the real costs of such decisions are always paid. Charles, who had authorized the ban with a signature that visibly trembled according to those present, retreated to Highgrove immediately after the announcement was released. Staff reported that he appeared hollow, aged by years in a single day, moving through the familiar rooms of his private residence like a ghost haunting his own life. The woman he had loved and defended through decades of controversy, the woman for whom he had weathered public condemnation and family disapproval, had betrayed not only the institution he was sworn to protect, but the trust he had placed in her. And that betrayal, however it had come about, whatever complex mixture of fear and ambition had driven it, could never be undone. Camilla herself was moved under security escort to a private residence in Wiltshire, a property she owned independently of the crown, purchased years earlier as a refuge from the intensity of royal life. She was not under arrest. The palace had carefully avoided language that would suggest criminal wrongdoing, but the terms of her ban included significant restrictions. She was prohibited from speaking publicly about royal matters, barred from using her title in any commercial context, and stripped of the security detail that had protected her since she became queen consort. For a woman who had spent nearly 20 years as a working royal, the transition was brutal. One moment, she was queen consort of the United Kingdom, seated beside the king at state functions, her image on official currency and postage stamps. The next, she was effectively a private citizen, stripped of status, purpose, and the protection that status had provided. William and Anne, who had pushed hardest for the decisive action, both privately acknowledged the emotional toll of what had been done, though neither questioned the necessity. Anne, in a rare moment of vulnerability, reportedly told a close confidant, "I take no pleasure in this outcome, but the crown must survive, even when the people within it do not." Institutions endure because they demonstrate that no individual, regardless of rank or personal history, stands above the principles that give those institutions legitimacy. William, speaking to Catherine in the privacy of their apartment at Kensington Palace, was more direct. "We had no choice," he said simply. "The alternative was to allow the monarchy to be compromised by someone who placed personal interest above institutional duty. That is not sustainable, regardless of who commits the offense." The aftermath and lessons. As the shock of December 4th began to settle into a new reality, the monarchy found itself navigating territory it had not faced in modern history. A sitting queen consort, banned forever, not through death or divorce, but through misconduct. The precedent was staggering, and its implications would shape the royal family for generations. Inside the palace, the immediate priority was stabilization. Staff worked through the night to update all official documentation, removing Camilla's name from ceremonial rosters, event planning documents, and communication protocols. Portraits were quietly relocated. Her personal office was sealed and its contents inventoried by legal representatives. Every trace of her administrative involvement was methodically erased, not out of malice but out of necessity. The institution had to function, and it could only do so if the contamination was fully excised. For Charles, the personal reckoning was far more complex than any administrative adjustment. He had spent his entire life waiting to be king, and when he finally ascended, he had done so with Camilla at his side, believing she would be his steady partner in the difficult work of modernizing the monarchy. Now, that partnership was not only over, it had been revealed as a fundamental miscalculation. Those close to the king described a man grappling with profound disillusionment, questioning not only his judgment but his understanding of the woman he thought he knew. The emotional toll manifested in small but telling ways. Charles canceled several public engagements, citing the need for personal reflection. He spent long hours walking the grounds of Highgrove alone, a solitary figure moving through the winter landscape as though searching for answers the frozen earth could not provide. William, by contrast, approached the aftermath with characteristic pragmatism. He understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to demonstrate accountability, even when that accountability required painful sacrifices. In a private meeting with senior advisors, he reportedly said, "We cannot be seen as above the rules we claim to uphold. If that means losing someone we love, then that is the price of integrity." His words, though harsh, reflected a generational shift in how the royal family understood its role. For William, the institution was not a family to be protected at all costs. It was a public trust, and that trust could only be maintained through transparency and decisive action when trust was broken. Anne, ever the disciplinarian, focused her energy on reinforcing the structural reforms that would prevent such a situation from recurring. She worked with the master of the household to implement new oversight mechanisms for property management, ensuring that no single individual, regardless of rank, could authorize movements or appraisals without multi-layered approval. She also advocated for regular independent audits of all royal collections, a recommendation that was quickly adopted and formalized into palace policy. For Anne, Camilla's downfall was not a personal tragedy. It was a case study in what happens when traditional deference is mistaken for proper oversight. But perhaps the most poignant aftermath belonged to Zara and Mike Tindall, the two individuals whose accidental involvement had triggered the entire crisis. Both struggled with the weight of what had unfolded. Mike, in particular, found himself replaying the moment he opened that storage container, wondering whether he could have handled it differently, whether there was a way to have addressed the issue that would not have resulted in such a catastrophic outcome. Zara, protective of her husband and fiercely loyal to her mother Anne, reassured him repeatedly that he had done the right thing. The discovery was not the problem. The actions that necessitated the discovery were. Still, the knowledge that their family had been the catalyst for such upheaval sat heavily on both of them. As December progressed and the initial shock faded into a new normal, the broader lessons of Camilla's ban began to emerge. For the monarchy, it was a stark reminder that no one, regardless of title or proximity to power, was exempt from accountability. The institution had survived because it demonstrated, however imperfectly, that it could police itself when necessary. For the public, especially older viewers who had watched Camilla's long journey from mistress to queen, the lesson was more ambiguous. Some saw vindication, a confirmation that she had never truly belonged. Others saw tragedy, a woman who had fought so hard for acceptance only to lose everything through a miscalculation of entitlement. From my own perspective, watching this story unfold, I was struck by how quickly legacy can unravel. Camilla had spent years rehabilitating her image, earning grudging respect for her charitable work and steady presence beside Charles. And yet, in a single day, all of that was erased. It serves as a powerful reminder that character, ultimately, is revealed not in the titles we hold or the roles we perform, but in the choices we make when we believe no one is watching. In the end, Camilla's ban was not simply a royal decree. It was a statement about boundaries, about the difference between earning a place and assuming ownership of it. And as the winter deepened across Britain, one truth settled over the monarchy like frost on stone. Trust, once broken, can rarely be rebuilt, and power, once abused, is never returned. The fall of Queen Camilla reminds us that no position is permanent, and no betrayal is without consequence. If you found this story as shocking as I did, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what lessons do you take from this historic moment? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter in this royal saga is already unfolding. Thank you for watching.